Have you ever paid for a seat you rightfully own only to realize, in someone else's eyes, you still don't belong there? That night, under the blinding lights of a packed airport, a black man in a deep navy suit, carrying a suitcase polished like glass, walked up to the check-in counter with a first-class ticket. But instead of a welcoming smile, he was met with a cold shake of the head. First class is for special guests, sir. They didn't look at his ticket, they only looked at his skin. Malcolm Reeves, a name revered across the tech world, stood there. Calm. No one in that line knew they were speaking to a CEO who could buy the entire airline. But for Malcolm, the real pain wasn't the insult, it was how familiar it felt. He had paid, succeeded, shattered every barrier, and still had to prove he deserved a seat. But what they didn't know Malcolm wasn't the kind of man who stayed silent and swallowed humiliation. He had built his life proving people wrong and making them pay for their assumptions. And in just 12 minutes, that first-class cabin they thought was reserved for special guests would turn into a stage for a lesson no one would forget. That flight wouldn't take off, that arrogant pilot wouldn't be behind the controls, and everyone would learn sometimes. The greatest power isn't in shouting, but in the kind of silence that brings an entire system to its knees. If you've ever been disrespected in a place you paid to belong, like share and subscribe, because this isn't just a story about a canceled flight. It's about how one black man, in quiet defiance, grounded an entire plane to teach the world how to truly see a person. Malcolm Reeves moved through the terminal as if everything around him was just set dressing. The deep navy suit fit like it had been cut for him alone, and the amber leather suitcase gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting the sterile white ceiling tiles. He walked like a man used to boardrooms on the top floor, not the crowded waiting areas of an airport, but none of that made the gate agent raise an eyebrow. She didn't see a customer. She saw an error in the system, a man out of place. Sir, first class is for special guests. The words came out like muscle memory, no greeting, no offer to take his ticket, not even a beat of hesitation. Just a paper-thin smile and eyes that had already decided he didn't belong behind that door. Malcolm didn't respond. He'd heard too many versions of Only Four in his life, from playgrounds as a boy, to early startup boardrooms, to gala dinners where people asked what he did before they asked what table he was at. These words weren't about money or status. They were about the kind of person they thought he was allowed to be. He handed her his ticket. She flinched, just slightly, before taking it, her gaze shifting from dismissive to begrudging, like someone forced to correct a mistake they'd rather ignore. But Malcolm felt something sharper than her reaction the stairs from behind him. People in line raising their brows, pressing their lips together. Nobody said it out loud, but the message was the same. He doesn't look like someone who belongs in first class. In a blink, Malcolm wasn't in this terminal anymore. He was 12 again, in an ill-fitting white dress shirt, swallowed by the brown leather seat of a plane he wasn't supposed to be on. He could still hear the flight attendant's voice. "Son, this isn't your seat. You need to move." The murmurs, the sidelong glances, the suffocating feeling not from a cramped row but from his pride being forced to bow. He remembered standing up, eyes glued to the floor as he walked back, and promising himself that one day he'd take those seats without asking, without explaining. That promise had brought him here, but a $1,000 suit and a first-class ticket still couldn't erase what people saw when they looked at him. Malcolm Reeves breathed slowly. He knew this game, and this time, he wouldn't stand up. But what they didn't know was this: the man they were trying to push aside was the one person who could keep this plane from ever leaving the ground. He didn't rush. He placed the ticket on the counter like a final chess piece. The agent glanced down, then back up at him, searching for some crack in his presence, something to confirm her assumption that he didn't belong. Her eyes said everything. "You're not like the people I usually serve here." "Seat 1A, he said, his voice steady and low, like he was ordering his usual at a familiar restaurant. Her lips twitched into a thin, insincere smile. "Are you sure?" A harmless-sounding question loaded with insult. Malcolm tilted his head, his gaze calm but sharp as a blade. "I thought first class was about tickets, not genetics." The air between them tightened. The words weren't loud, weren't cruel, but they stripped away the smugness she wore like armor. A faint blush crept up her cheeks. Her hand stiffened as she took the ticket, typing quickly as if to end the exchange. Behind him, the line had gone quiet, like everyone was holding back a collective "oh." Malcolm didn't smile, didn't soften. He just stood there, hands behind his back, like a professor waiting for a student to recognize their own mistake. He didn't need to add anything. Sometimes silence makes people listen the most. She printed his new boarding pass and handed it back with a flat, "You may proceed." Her voice was polite, but drained of confidence. Malcolm took the pass and gave her a small nod. "Thank you," 2 quiet syllables that, to her, felt like the period at the end of a lesson she hadn't prepared to learn. He walked past the gate without looking back. The stares that had followed him changed less judgment, more discomfort, maybe even curiosity. Everyone knew it now. This wasn't just a passenger. This was someone who'd just taught the check-in desk a lesson they'd never put in a training manual. Malcolm didn't slow down. He adjusted his cufflinks, his pace deliberate. He wasn't walking like a man who'd been humbled. He was walking like a man who'd already calculated his next move. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to explode. Outbursts were for people with no other options. Malcolm had more than one, and he knew exactly which one to choose to make sure the system would remember his name, or more importantly, his place. A young man in line watched him go, a mix of awe and unease in his eyes. Malcolm caught the look and nodded slightly, as if to say, "Yes, I used to be you, quietly enduring, but not today." His mind flickered through memories, the boardrooms where he'd been dismissed before proving he was the smartest in the room. The negotiations where they spoke to his skin color more than to him. His life had been one long chess match. He'd lost plenty of small games, but each one had taught him how to make moves his opponents wouldn't walk away from. They don't know who they're dealing with, but they will. The thought wasn't pride, it was a cold fact. Malcolm Reeves understood power, not the kind in headlines or on business cards, the kind that could flip a board when everyone thought the game was over. He wasn't here to prove he belonged in first class. He was here to remind them those seats only existed because people like him still tolerated sitting in them. The air around him shifted. Those watching him walk away now kept their distance. Like people who'd realized the man they were ready to dismiss might be the same man who could shut down their entire party. As he stepped into the jet bridge toward first class, Malcolm felt the real game beginning. And waiting for him inside that cabin was someone far more confident than the gate agent, a new opponent who didn't yet know the board belonged to Malcolm. The walkway into first class was a narrow passageway, lined with thick ash-gray carpet that made every step feel heavier. Malcolm moved toward the cabin door, each stride deliberate, the walk of a man who had passed through many doors where he wasn't welcomed. Just a few more steps, and he'd reach 1A, the seat he had paid for, the space he had earned. But just before the threshold, a figure blocked his way. The pilot. He was the kind of man who clearly preferred being called by his title rather than his name. His uniform was so crisp it looked like it had been starched into shape. The polished epaulettes glinting like they'd been buffed daily. His tanned face was carved with the kind of deep lines that come from decades of self-assuredness. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Smiles were for people he thought deserved them. "First class is full. Step back." The pilot's voice was gravelly but commanding the tone of someone used to issuing orders, not receiving questions. He didn't glance at the ticket in Malcolm's hand. He didn't need to. He had already looked at Malcolm long enough to decide he didn't belong. Malcolm stopped. No expression, no anger, just stillness, a stone in the current. The pilot was probably used to people either snapping back or backing down. Malcolm did neither. He simply stood there. The silence between them grew dense, heavy enough to press into the narrow passageway. The pilot's brow twitched, the smallest movement betraying his expectation of a reaction. But Malcolm stayed rooted, his spine straight, one hand resting lightly on his suitcase, his gaze unflinching. He didn't need to speak to make this an encounter. Sometimes, presence alone rewrites the script others think they're directing. What the pilot didn't know, this wasn't Malcolm's first time playing this game, but this time he wouldn't play by someone else's rules. Somewhere behind him, a murmur started. A woman whispered, "What's going on?" A man smirked, settling in like he was about to watch a pre-flight sideshow. They had no idea this wasn't entertainment. Malcolm said nothing, but inside him, the pieces were already moving. One timely move, and the whole board would flip. The pilot still didn't understand that the man he was blocking wasn't just a passenger. He was the one person who could decide whether this flight ever took off. The air near the cabin entrance shifted as the pilot repeated himself, that same gravelly, commanding tone. "First class is full. Step back." Behind Malcolm, there were small sounds, the hush of curiosity, a sharp inhale, a poorly stifled chuckle. A middle-aged couple whispered to each other, another one booked the wrong seat. The man folded his arms with a smug little smile, while the woman looked Malcolm over like he'd crashed an exclusive dinner party. Further back, a young man in a hoodie pulled out one earbud and glanced up, interested. The narrow passage had become a stage, and Malcolm, unwillingly, was the lead. But if they were expecting anger, an outburst, a scene, they would be disappointed. Malcolm didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't even blink. He stood like a statue, a figure carved from stillness. His eyes were cold and steady, without the submissiveness or flustered apology they were expecting from a caught passenger. That stare, calm, unwavering, made the pilot hesitate, just for a fraction of a second. Malcolm caught it. The man was used to darting eyes, nervous stammering, predictable anger, but this look was different. It was reflective, solid. It forced him to see himself through the very authority he was trying to assert. Silence, Malcolm's most refined weapon, was doing its work. A darkly humorous thought flickered in Malcolm's mind. They paid for service, and I paid for a performance I never agreed to give. But he didn't smile. He let it sit, unsaid. The giggles behind him faltered, thinning into awkwardness. People were waiting to see where this standoff would go. Malcolm wasn't moving. He let the pilot feel every stretched second, and for anyone who thought he'd back down, they were about to learn the game hadn't even started. And with just one move, one perfectly timed move, every role in this little play would reverse. Malcolm didn't explain himself, didn't argue his rights, didn't demand acknowledgement. Instead, he quietly slid his carry-on to the side, stepped past the pilot without so much as a glance, and sat down in 1A. It was fast, clean, executed with the precision of someone not just claiming a seat, but reclaiming a place that had always been his. The whispers behind him died instantly. No one expected his resistance to be silence. Not fury, not theater, just stillness. And yet, something about the way he sat composed, deliberate, unsettled them more than any shouting match could. Malcolm leaned back, adjusting his cufflinks like he was in his own office, not a cramped cabin under scrutiny. He didn't look at the pilot, didn't acknowledge the gawking passengers. To him, this wasn't confrontation, it was choreography. Sometimes just sitting down is scarier than any threat, he thought. In the big negotiations, He'd learned that the most powerful people don't shout. They occupy space until everyone else has to adjust around them. The pilot stayed rooted by the door, his lips pressed thin, struggling with the new reality a passenger had defied his order calmly, cleanly, and completely. The pilot's authority, rehearsed for decades, suddenly felt flimsy in the face of someone who didn't need to perform for it. In the rows behind, passengers leaned forward. The earlier chuckles were gone. No one found this amusing anymore. They sensed it, the shift. This wasn't spectacle anymore. It was a quiet battle for control, one that none of them wanted to interrupt. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, shutting out the cabin noise. He'd played this game too many times, and the first move was always silence. Let them wonder, who did we just try to block? When he opened his eyes, there was the faintest curl at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, a warning. And for anyone who thought this confrontation was over, they were about to find out how wrong they were. Malcolm opened his eyes, as if deciding the game others started was over on his terms. He reached under his seat, retrieved a small leather case, and pulled out his phone. His movements were slow but deliberate, the kind that made everyone watching forget to blink. This wasn't the reach for a phone call to a relative to vent. Everyone felt it. Whatever this call was, it wasn't ordinary. He pressed the phone to his ear. Ground operations. His voice was low and steady, the kind of tone that didn't need volume to command. This is Reeves. Flight 227, Gate C7. Shut it down. The last two words, shut it down, landed softly, almost casually, but they rippled through the cabin like a silent explosion. Two flight attendants standing nearby froze. One darted a glance at her colleague, eyes wide, like she had just heard a passcode meant for people far above her pay grade. The name Reeves wasn't unfamiliar. In aviation circles, it appeared in corporate memos, at high-level meetings, in conversations that trickled down from boardrooms, but this hearing it in person, tied to a face, a voice, and an order was different. The lead flight attendant swallowed hard and tried to steady her voice as she stepped closer. "Sir, excuse me, did you just say—" Malcolm didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the plane's open door, phone still at his ear, as if she were nothing but background noise. Yes. Shut it down, no explanation, no elaboration. Because for him, words like that didn't require understanding. They only required execution. Behind him, the murmurs grew. "Reeves," a man whispered. "Is that—" The rest of his thought disappeared into the tight air of the cabin. No one dared to finish it. Seat 1A. The very spot that minutes ago had been questioned, nearly denied, had become a makeshift throne, and the man sitting in it didn't need to raise his voice for the entire cabin to feel smaller. For a moment, Malcolm thought about every time he had been forced to prove himself in boardrooms, at galas, even in first-class cabins. He'd learned that sometimes. You don't argue for your place. You show them that if they don't acknowledge it, the whole game stops. He ended the call and tucked the phone into his jacket pocket like nothing had happened. But everyone who witnessed it knew that call had just turned the cabin to stone. And no one here realized yet that a clock had started 12 minutes until everything turned upside down. A sharp, mocking laugh broke the silence. The pilot, still standing at the cabin door, arms crossed, watching every second of Malcolm's call. He didn't bother to hide his disdain. "Who do you think you are, giving orders here?" His voice was louder now, pitched so the entire cabin could hear. A power play meant to reassert control. A few passengers chuckled. Others craned their necks for a better look at the arrogant man who dared challenge the captain on his own plane. Malcolm didn't answer. He didn't even look up. He leaned back in his seat, flipping to the next page of the document in his hand as if the pilot's question were no more important than the hum of the air vents. No outrage, no retort, just an unnerving, clinical indifference. Finally, He spoke, quietly. 12 minutes. The words were soft, almost a whisper, but they hit the cabin like a dropped weight. The snickering stopped. The pilot blinked. "Excuse me." Malcolm lowered the papers to his lap, laced his fingers together, and spoke slowly, deliberately. "You have 12 minutes to understand what just happened. Or not, but when the clock runs out, you'll know exactly what you've done." The absolute certainty in his tone made the air thicken. No one knew what was coming, but his voice wasn't the voice of a man bluffing. It was the voice of someone used to giving orders and watching them unfold. A flight attendant crept up to the pilot, whispering urgently. Malcolm didn't need to hear the words to know the message. "Don't touch this. Don't push this man." But the pilot just scoffed, jaw tight, eyes locked on Malcolm like he was testing the percentage of bluff in those 12 minutes. Malcolm closed his eyes, resting his head against the seat. He didn't need to do more. His silence spoke louder than any argument. The game was no longer in the hands of the man still trying to play it. In the biggest deals of his life, Malcolm had learned one rule. The man who talks the most is usually the one most afraid. The quiet one, he's the real threat. And as the clock ticked, everyone in that cabin was about to learn Malcolm Reeves hadn't just joined the game. He'd reset the board. The first-class cabin was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place for quiet naps, the rustle of newspapers, or the slow swirl of wine in a crystal glass before a long flight. But now, it felt like an improvised theater. Every pair of eyes fixed on one man at center stage, Malcolm Reeves, the man who had just given an order to shut it down on a flight everyone assumed only the pilot had the authority to control. Across the aisle, an elderly woman with perfectly set silver hair and a string of pearls the size of olives leaned toward her husband, whispering. Who was he to call off a flight? She didn't wait for an answer. Her voice trembled, betraying a strange mix of irritation and awe. A boy in the row behind, wide-eyed and devouring the scene, tugged at his mother's sleeve. Is he an actor in his world? Only superheroes or movie stars could make an entire plane go silent with a single phone call. Malcolm heard every word, but he didn't respond. His eyes stayed on the pages in front of him, flipping them at an unhurried, deliberate pace. His posture was loose, shoulders relaxed, fingers turning the pages in a rhythm that felt rehearsed. It wasn't just reading, it was a message. This stage doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me. And I choose my role here. The air in the cabin had transformed into a particular kind of tension, the hush of a theater just before the curtain rises, when the audience knows they're about to see something they can't predict. And strangely, those in attendance had instinctively drawn inward. A man in a designer polo who had been smirking moments ago cleared his throat, then said nothing. A young woman furtively unlocked her phone to record, only to freeze under the sharp look of the lead flight attendant, tucking it away like a child caught misbehaving. No one dared disrupt the rhythm Malcolm was setting. Malcolm Reeves knew his audience. He didn't need to perform for them. He only had to let them see just enough for their imaginations to do the rest. And imagination, he knew, was always more terrifying than the truth. He stopped on a page, signed his name with a few quick strokes, then closed the folder. Slowly, intentionally. They had no idea the main act hadn't even begun. When the curtain finally rose, none of them would be able to stay in their seats. Malcolm set down his pen, leaned back, and let his gaze drift out the window. The golden runway lights blurred against the night sky. But in his mind, another image came sharply into focus, the cramped cabin of an airplane from 26 years ago. He was 12, wearing the crisply ironed white shirt his mother had pressed, khaki pants that hit awkwardly above the ankle, and sneakers his father called the best we can afford. It was his first time flying. His parents had scraped and saved to give him an experience they believed would open the world a seat in business class. But the moment Malcolm settled into the soft beige seat, a tall shadow fell over him. A flight attendant, the kind with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Sweetheart, you're in the wrong seat. Back to coach. This isn't for you." Malcolm remembered every word. He remembered the stares from the surrounding passengers, the way they looked at the skinny black boy as though he were a stain on the spotless white tablecloth of business class. His hands had trembled as he held out the ticket. I have a seat here." "Back to coach," she repeated, not even glancing at the ticket, and he stood. He hadn't cried, but the shame clung to him for the entire flight as he curled up in an economy seat, staring through the thin curtain at the silhouettes being served wine and warm towels. It wasn't just a seat taken away. It was a message, "You don't belong here." 26 years later, Malcolm Reeves had walked into boardrooms where they thought he didn't deserve a place, had signed contracts that turned the very people who once dismissed him into subordinates. He'd paid a steep price to tear down that curtain. But some wounds, he knew, never fully heal. Malcolm blinked, the memory dissolving. The first-class cabin glowed softly around him, silent but different now. He wasn't that boy anymore. And everyone in this cabin, including the pilot still standing guard, was about to understand that they hadn't just disrespected a passenger. They'd touched a scar that never really went away. He tilted his head back and closed his eyes briefly, tucking the old memory into the dark corner of his mind. A faint, humorless chuckle escaped his lips, curling the corner of his mouth. Maybe I should fly under a fake name to keep from disturbing anyone. The thought wasn't spoken aloud, but it tasted sharp in his mind, heavy with irony. He thought of the stages he'd stood on, the photos taken with heads of state, the articles that hailed him as one of the most influential CEOs of his time. Yet in spaces they still believed belonged to them. His accomplishments evaporated into invisibility. Malcolm opened his eyes. The first-class cabin looked like a stage, and he, whether he wanted to or not, was playing the lead. The faces stealing glances at him, the pearl-draped woman clutching her bag, the young man pretending to scroll his phone but tilting his head just slightly toward Malcolm, the middle-aged woman whispering behind her hand to her seatmate, each different, but all fixed on him, waiting for the next act. They weren't just curious about the man. They were fascinated by the collision, the raw clash between one individual's power and an entire system's routine. If he's just a regular passenger, they wondered silently, why is the entire crew suddenly holding their breath? Why isn't anyone telling him to move? Malcolm adjusted his watch, a small motion that made a few passengers shift in their seats. They thought they'd just witnessed a cue, the start of another scene. He noticed and found it amusing. How strange, he thought, that simply sitting in the right seat could make an entire room forget how to breathe. Moments like this didn't require him to fight for attention. He let it come to him. And, like any good play, he knew exactly when to pull the audience toward the climax, that moment when no one dared look away. Malcolm flipped to another page, signed his name again, as if nothing significant were happening. But he knew every pair of eyes remained locked on him. And when the curtain finally rose, not a single soul in that cabin would be prepared for what they were about to see. The shrill ring of a phone slashed through the heavy silence of the cabin like an unexpected blade. It wasn't from a passenger, it wasn't from a flight attendant. It came from the radio clipped to the shoulder of the pilot, the self-appointed gatekeeper still blocking the doorway. He flinched, tilted his head to listen, then snatched the device to his ear. Yes, his voice started professional, steady. But within seconds, his face changed. His brows shot up, his jaw locked. Then he barked out, "What?" Malcolm didn't lift his head. He heard every word, but his eyes stayed fixed on the documents in front of him, as if none of this had anything to do with him. That calmness only turned the screws tighter on everyone watching. The pilot gripped the radio so hard his knuckles whitened. "Are you kidding me? Off the aircraft right now?" His voice boomed through the cabin. A breathless pause. Then an outburst, his composure gone. "For a black passenger. You've got to be kidding me." The words stabbed through the air like poisoned arrows. The first-class cabin froze. Someone gasped audibly. The pearl-draped woman clutched her husband's hand like a lifeline. The boy in the back row stared wide-eyed, not fully understanding the words but sensing their weight. The pilot hadn't meant for those words to be public. They were for the headset, a private protest to whoever had just upended his authority. But once they spilled into the cabin, they weren't just the angry outburst of a man losing control. They were a confession, an admission that the man in seat 1A had never been seen as just another passenger. The lead flight attendant flinched, glanced briefly at Malcolm, then quickly looked away. No one said a word, but their faces said everything a line had just been crossed, and there was no pulling it back. Malcolm set his pen down and tapped a slow rhythm on the folder's cover. Still silent, still unmoved. He didn't need to speak. He knew everyone who needed to hear had already heard enough. His silence wasn't submission. It was a noose tightening, inch by inch, around the neck of the man who'd just shouted those words. In the row behind, a passenger lifted his phone and started recording. One moment captured, and soon it would spread faster than any plane could fly. And in that instant, the first-class cabin began to understand the man they once thought was just a passenger had turned this entire aircraft into his chessboard. The pilot's words, "For a black passenger, you've got to be kidding me," hadn't even faded before the young man streaming from his seat hit go live. He didn't need to add commentary. The video itself said everything the pilot, red-faced, gripping his radio like it was the last vestige of his authority, yelling in front of his crew and passengers. "This can't go unpunished," the young man muttered, more to himself than anyone. A few taps later, the stream was live. The caption on the corner of the screen read Flight 227, pilot loses it. Malcolm still didn't look up. He didn't need to. In this age, nothing stayed behind closed doors. Words always had wings. And this one, it was already flying. Within a minute, the flight attendant's phone started buzzing in rapid succession. Messages from colleagues on the ground, from family, from others already watching the live feed. "What's happening up there?" No one answered. They didn't know what to say. The faces in the first class began to change. A few minutes ago, some had leaned back with smirks, amused at the out-of-place man being blocked at the gate. But now, the smiles had drained away. They traded nervous glances. One woman fiddled with her seatbelt, her hands trembling slightly. A man in the opposite row leaned toward his companion, whispering, "If this is real, do you know who he is?" And in that moment, they all realized this wasn't a spat between a pilot and a passenger anymore. It had become an event, one the entire world could soon be watching. Malcolm shifted slightly, crossing one leg over the other, setting his pen aside. Still silent. But the air around him practically hummed with the message, "I don't have to do anything. The story is telling itself now." The pilot, perhaps realizing it too, spun on his heel toward the passenger live streaming. "Turn that off, now," he barked. But it was too late. Comments were already scrolling across the feed outrage. Questions, mockery. One snarky message stood out. "Good luck keeping your job after that." The atmosphere had flipped completely, from smugness to unease, from dismissal to dread. Malcolm took a slow breath, not for composure, but to savor the moment. He'd seen this before, arrogant men digging their own graves. And just one more move, he knew, would change the entire game, a move that would make sure no one ever underestimated the man in 1A again. The live stream had been up for only minutes, but the ripple was already spreading. A text pinged the lead flight attendant's phone. "Who's in 1A? Is that Reeves?" She looked up, meeting Malcolm's eyes for a split second, then quickly looked away like his gaze could read her thoughts. That name Reeves began to spread in hushed voices across the cabin. A silver-haired man leaned toward his wife. "Reeves, isn't that the chairman of the parent company?" His wife swallowed hard, suddenly pale. A younger man frantically searched his phone, then whispered like he'd uncovered a state secret. "It is. That's him. He's the chairman of the entire airline." The first-class cabin, once a sanctuary for the entitled, fell silent as a tomb. They'd seen Malcolm as an intruder, someone who needed to be put in his place. But now they understood they were the guests in his house, literally. The pilot, the man who had just screamed that career-ending sentence, now looked like someone caught in a spotlight with nowhere to run. He turned to the lead flight attendant, but she averted her eyes, wanting no part in the disaster swallowing his career. And Malcolm. He sat there, the picture of composure, as if he were in his top-floor office instead of a tense, airless cabin. He didn't look up. He didn't respond. He simply flipped to another page in his thick stack of documents and made a small, deliberate note in the margin. His silence wasn't avoidance. It was a statement: "I don't need to confirm anything. You'll figure it out on your own." A few passengers opened their mouths to apologize, to explain, maybe to beg, but stopped themselves. No one dared break the rhythm Malcolm had set. He'd turned the cabin into his office without moving a single piece of furniture. Then, for the first time, Malcolm lifted his eyes. He glanced at the pilot, one short, cold look, heavy as a gavel hitting the block. Then he lowered his gaze again and kept writing. Just one look, and everyone in that cabin understood the pilot's game was over. But Malcolm's. It had only just begun. Because in just a few minutes, they were all about to witness how a man could turn silence into a verdict not just for one pilot, but for an entire system. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed in the narrow jetway. The cabin door swung open, and in stepped a team of ground crew flanked by an airline representative in a sharp silver-gray suit. They didn't need to explain why they were here. Everyone understood instantly. The pilot, the self-appointed gatekeeper of this flight, now looked like a dethroned king. His face was flushed, though no one could tell whether it was from rage or humiliation. He stepped back half a pace as the representative leaned in to whisper in his ear, but his response came out loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "You're pulling me over this?" Over a black passenger sitting in the wrong seat. The words froze the cabin. It wasn't just gasoline on an already burning fire, it was the final nail in the coffin of his career, hammered in front of dozens of witnesses. Passengers held their breath. The lead flight attendant bowed her head. Hands knotted together as if she could disappear into the floor. "This is a directive from the top," the airline rep said quickly. Voice carefully calm. "You are to leave the aircraft immediately." "You'll regret this," the pilot snarled, but his voice cracked. He squirmed against the firm but unyielding hands on his shoulders. Yet, step by step, he walked, heavy, defeated steps, the steps of a man who knew the game was over. Malcolm didn't look up. He didn't follow the pilot with his eyes. He simply set his pen down, turned a page in his file, and kept reading as if this scene had been written in the script long before takeoff. For Malcolm, this wasn't a victory worth celebrating. It was procedure. The airline rep turned to him, bowing so deeply it was almost a 90-degree angle. "We sincerely apologize for what has happened. Mr. Reeves, this was an egregious failure of our crew. It will be dealt with immediately." His voice dropped low, just loud enough for the cabin to hear, but with a quiver that betrayed his fear. Malcolm let the silence hang. It stretched long enough to make the man sweat. Then, finally, he said 2 words. "I know." That was it. Just 2 words, enough to make the representative bow deeper, like a man receiving judgment and accepting it. First class, once a lounge of quiet arrogance and idle chatter, was now so silent you could hear Malcolm's pen scratch against the paper. Power had shifted. Seat 1A was no longer just a seat. It was a throne. and the man sitting on it didn't need to shout to make it clear who the king was. What the cabin didn't yet realize was this: the king, who'd just been deposed the pilot, was only the first piece to fall. Malcolm remained still, one leg crossed over the other, hand resting lightly on his documents. He didn't need to watch the pilot's retreat. The entire cabin was watching for him. Some moments carved themselves into memory without a word. A pilot, the embodiment of absolute authority on a flight, being escorted off in front of the passenger he'd dismissed as an outsider, was one of them. Malcolm didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to threaten. He simply let them witness the transformation the man who had barked at him moments ago, stripped of every ounce of authority, reduced to nothing. That contrast, silent, merciless, was the sharpest strike of all. A wry thought flickered across Malcolm's mind. He should thank me. Not everyone gets such a dramatic exit scene. But he didn't say it. A king doesn't lower himself to speak of a man who's already been unseated. His silence made the others fill the void themselves. They watched like theater-goers at a perfectly choreographed play. Every eye on him carried the same unspoken question. Who is this man, that he can upend the order of an entire flight with one phone call? The rep still hovered beside him, bowing. Malcolm glanced at him briefly, just a fraction of a second, enough to make the man bow lower. No scolding, no further demands, just a cold, knowing look. It was all that was needed. In the biggest negotiations of his life, Malcolm had learned this truth: the most powerful person in the room isn't the one who shouts the loudest, it's the one who knows when not to speak. And today, that lesson was being taught all over again, here in a cramped first-class cabin. The passengers were beginning to understand this wasn't a customer in seat 1A. This was the man who owned the game they were playing. And the scariest part wasn't what he could do. It was that they couldn't predict what he would do next. Like a chessboard, more pieces would fall soon, and none of them would see it coming. Malcolm's eyes drifted back to his open file, the lines of text blurring as his mind moved elsewhere. He'd seen so many men mistake volume for power, men who believed slamming a table or barking an order made them untouchable. But true power, it was making others bow without lifting a finger. From check-in to this very moment, Malcolm hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. He'd sat down, made a single phone call, and gone quiet. And in that quiet, the cabin had been brought to its knees. The airline rep remained at his side, hands clasped tightly to hide their tremor. He'd apologized. He'd promised corrective action. And yet, Malcolm still hadn't offered anything more. That lack of response, that silence, was the most terrifying answer of all. Across the cabin, passengers who had once chuckled along with the pilot's gatekeeping now avoided Malcolm's gaze. No one wanted to be pulled into the orbit of the power they had just witnessed. The whispers were gone. In their place was a thick, suffocating silence, as if everyone was waiting for a verdict. Malcolm rested his chin lightly on his hand, surveying the cabin. He wasn't savoring revenge. This wasn't about personal satisfaction. It was about watching a system bow to the man it once deemed didn't belong. And that, he thought, was worth more than any outburst could achieve. They always said the power was in the cockpit, Malcolm mused. But today, it seems the power sits in 1A. He flipped to a new page in his documents, making notes as if this were just another morning in his corner office. No one interrupted. No one dared speak. They all knew every word uttered now might be remembered and used against them. Malcolm stopped writing. He looked up, sweeping the cabin with a single glance. That one look told them all, "You've seen what I am capable of." Then he lowered his gaze again and kept writing. And none of them knew what they had just witnessed was only the opening move. More pieces would fall. And Malcolm Reeves had only begun to play. Malcolm set his pen down, interlaced his fingers, and lifted his gaze to meet the airline representative still standing at the front of 1A. In that moment, he wasn't just a passenger, he owned the room. Ground the flight. His voice was calm, each word measured. It wasn't a request, it was an order. I want a full review of the entire crew. The air thickened instantly. The people standing nearby held their breath. The representative flinched, then quickly bowed his head, fumbling for his phone as he backed toward the door. Yes, sir. Right away, Mr. Reeves." A few passengers exchanged glances, shocked, curious, unsettled. Ground the flight. Who could give such an order except someone who owned the airline? And then they remembered the name whispered through the cabin. Reeves. Chairman? The man whose single phone call had just cost a pilot his job. Malcolm leaned back in his seat, fingers steepled like he was presiding over a closed-door board meeting. He didn't owe anyone an explanation. Sometimes explanations only diluted the weight of a decision. The smart ones would understand this wasn't about an angry pilot or an insulted passenger. This was about the system itself, and Malcolm was sending it a cold, precise message: change, or stop altogether. The lead flight attendant approached, her face pale, her voice straining to stay steady. "Mr. Reeves, would you like water or wine while you wait?" Malcolm tilted his head, a razor-thin smile flickering across his face. "No. Focus on the flight." A boy in the row behind tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, who is that man?" She didn't answer, because she wasn't sure she wanted to. The cabin atmosphere had transformed completely. Gone were the smirks, the soft chuckles, the sidelong glances. In their place was the silence of people who had just watched a man turn an entire flight into a demonstration of authority, not with shouting, but with one icy order. Malcolm glanced at his watch. He wasn't in a rush. He knew what he'd set in motion would move faster than any plane they could put in the air. What they didn't know, this review wasn't just about inspecting a crew. It was a warning to anyone who might forget who they were really serving on Malcolm Reeves's flights. First class now felt like a church mid-prayer, hushed, reverent, and tinged with fear. Minutes ago, these people had whispered and giggled about the out-of-place man in 1A. Now no one dared open their mouth. Malcolm sat there, calm as if the tension thick enough to snap had nothing to do with him. But he knew. He had created it. The man in the pale suit, who had sized Malcolm up when he boarded, now quietly removed his watch and fiddled with it, desperate for an excuse not to look his way. Across the aisle, the woman with the oversized pearl necklace buried her face in her phone, her trembling fingers betraying her poise. And the boy who'd asked, "Who is he now?" sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, as if he'd learned the safest thing to do was stay invisible. But what Malcolm noticed most wasn't the passengers. It was the crew. The lead flight attendant, the one who had greeted him with that half-smile and averted gaze, now couldn't look him in the eye. Neither could the others. They moved slower, heads down, as though one glance from Malcolm could write them up on the spot. Malcolm said nothing. He didn't need to. Sometimes true power is letting people imagine for themselves what happens if they cross you again. He glanced toward the airline representative by the door, sweat staining the back of his shirt as he whispered frantically into his phone, reporting to someone higher up. Malcolm didn't need to hear the words. He knew the message. The flight is grounded. The crew is under review. The chairman is on board. Malcolm inhaled deeply and reclined. He'd been in many rooms of power boardrooms, political chambers, shareholder summits, but nowhere had ever been this quiet. Quiet not born of etiquette, quiet born of fear. That was the difference. And if they thought that fear was the climax, they were wrong. His next words would decide their fates. Malcolm set his pen down again, closed his folder, and placed it aside. Even that simple gesture made the cabin hold its breath. He'd been silent long enough for the silence to become unbearable. Now, when he finally chose to speak, they all knew these wouldn't be wasted words. He lifted his gaze to the lead flight attendant near the door. She froze when she realized he was looking at her. Her feet felt glued to the floor, her hands gripping the edge of her uniform. Malcolm spoke, his voice low, even, and clear. "Next time, check the ticket before you check the color." No sound, no whispers, no deep breaths, just those words, hanging heavy in the cabin simple, but as final as a sentence passed down in court. It wasn't an insult, it was a lesson. One too late to fix today, but one every person in that cabin, from the crew to the passengers, would carry with them for a long time. Malcolm didn't need to say more. He tilted his head, letting the faintest trace of a smile cross his lips. Not a triumphant grin, not gloating. It was the smile of a teacher closing a lesson, knowing the lesson would haunt the students. The lead attendant bowed deeply, her mouth opening as if to apologize, but no words came out. Malcolm didn't acknowledge it. He didn't need apologies. He needed them to remember the price of letting prejudice dictate their actions. A few passengers exchanged looks, silently confirming what they'd just witnessed. Even the representative, who had been so obedient and deferential, stepped back slightly, as if the words had been aimed at him too. Malcolm turned away, leaning back into his seat. He knew those words would echo in their minds long after this flight landed. That was the point, to make them carry the shame, the awareness, and the certainty that next time they'd look at the ticket before they looked at the skin. The faint smile remained on his lips, thin but sharp, like the final period at the end of a sentence no one could erase. And if they thought the lesson ended here, they were wrong. This was only the beginning of the changes Malcolm Reeves had just set in motion, starting right here in first class. The announcement echoed through the cabin, the flight attendant's voice trembling. "Ladies and gentlemen, Flight 227 has been canceled. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." Inconvenience. The word landed like a clumsy insult. No one on board believed what had just happened could be summed up in two polite syllables. This wasn't merely a canceled flight, this was an aftershock, and they were sitting at ground zero. Malcolm didn't react. He simply nodded, as though the announcement had unfolded exactly as he'd intended. To him, canceling this flight wasn't a disaster. It was a decision. A reminder that everything here, the plane, the people operating it, belonged to a system he controlled from its highest floor. Outside the cabin, that aftershock had already begun to spread, the video capturing the pilot's outburst. Because of a black passenger, "Are you kidding me?" had escaped the confines of that young man's phone. In less than 10 minutes, it had been shared thousands of times. The hashtag Flight227 began trending across platforms. Comments piled up in fury. "It's the 21st century. How is this still happening? Who is this man that the pilot thought he could scream at him like that? Does anyone know who the passenger in 1A is?" The lesson Malcolm had just delivered to first class was now projected onto countless phone screens. And this time, he didn't need to say a word. The world would speak for him to millions. A woman quietly closed her laptop, her eyes vacant. She didn't care why the flight had been canceled. All she could think was, "I just witnessed something that will be on the evening news." The man next to her hissed through his teeth, "We're about to be part of a media storm." Malcolm heard it all, but offered no commentary. He knew nothing was stronger than a story that spreads on its own. And he had just given this one wings. The airline representative returned, his voice low and urgent. "We'll arrange a private jet for you immediately, Mr. Reeves." Malcolm only gave a slight nod, as if that were the obvious next step. And as he rose from 1A, everyone in the cabin understood this story wasn't ending here. It had only just begun to take flight faster than any plane they'd ever boarded. Malcolm Reeves descended the aircraft steps like a man leaving a closed-door meeting, not the battlefield that had just shaken an entire industry. The fluorescent glow of the terminal lit his navy suit, making his silhouette stand out though he wasn't seeking attention. There were no bodyguards, no cameras, just a man with a small leather case, walking across polished tiles, his shoes clicking rhythmically like a clock marking his own time. A ground crew member stole a glance at him as he passed, half ready to greet him, then thought better of it, not out of arrogance, but because there were no words fit for the moment. Malcolm didn't need applause. He didn't need a parade. He had long understood the truly powerful never have to flaunt their power. He left the airport like a man finishing a day's work, leaving the storm behind without so much as a backward glance. In that moment, Malcolm thought of the 12-year-old boy he once was, sitting hunched in economy, head bowed after being kicked out of a seat he held a valid ticket for. If I could speak to him now, he thought, I'd tell him, don't cry. One day you'll sit in a seat no one will dare take from you. And if they try, they'll be the ones leaving first. He paused at the exit, pulling out his phone. The screen was flooded with notifications from his secretary, his board, even powerful friends who had already seen the incident circulate online. Malcolm didn't open them. He only made one short call, "Prepare the boardroom. I'm on my way." No need for further explanation. The person on the other end understood an earthquake had struck, and Malcolm Reeves was already drafting the blueprint for reconstruction. He stepped through the glass doors, the night air sweeping in with a strange, bracing chill. But Malcolm didn't feel cold. He knew that when one airport door closed behind him, another, louder, bigger, had just opened on the global stage. As he slid into the waiting car, no one yet realized this quiet exit would trigger changes beyond anyone's imagination in the aviation industry. The car pulled onto the road, the rows of yellow runway lights fading behind like a slow-burning fuse. Malcolm leaned back, gazing through the window. Beyond, planes were still taxiing, still preparing for takeoff, as if the world hadn't just shifted under its own weight. He wasn't thinking about the fired pilot, or the trembling flight attendants bracing for their reports. He was thinking about something else. A question that lingered. How many flights are still carrying that same arrogance? Not the arrogance of one man, but of a system, one that had grown comfortable wielding power as if it were a birthright written in skin tone and social standing. Malcolm smirked, a thin, almost imperceptible curl of his lips. And how many other Malcolms have stayed silent instead of stopping the whole journey to teach them how to see a person? He knew he was fortunate. He had the influence, the position, the power to turn a confrontation into a lesson for an entire industry. But what about those who couldn't call one number and stop a plane? How many times had they endured those stares, those words, swallowing their rage just to avoid being thrown out of a space they had every right to occupy? The car merged onto the highway, the night swallowing the glow of the airport. Malcolm unlocked his phone. Headlines were already live, pilot suspended after discriminatory outburst. Chairman Reeves on Flight 227, silent action that stopped a flight. He scrolled past them without pausing. He didn't need anyone else to tell his story. What he needed was for the story to tell itself not about him, but about what it exposed. Malcolm leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the hum of the tires carry him forward. Today's game was over, but the questions he'd left behind would outlast any flight. And somewhere, on other planes, sat countless Malcolms still waiting for the day they could stop everything just to remind the world. See the person before you, see their skin. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.